Hello and welcome to everyone joining us today. I'm Grania Hallahan and I'm the Senior Analyst at TES, formerly known as the Times Educational Supplement. I'll be chairing the panel today and I'm thrilled to have been asked to take on this role for protection approaches. I've got a few housekeeping points before we begin. So please do be aware that this session is going to be recorded. We would love to hear your questions, so please use the question and answer function found on the right-hand side of your screen. We, of course, would love you to tweet along and use the @IBVPrev, P-R-E-V, handle and the hashtag Future of Education when you do. Afterwards, the recording of the event will be shared via the Protection Approaches YouTube channel. And I think that's all the little bits that you need to know. Today is the launch event of Protection Approaches' latest publication, which was released today, Building Stronger Communities Through Critical and Compassionate Schooling. And it's an impressive publication. The paper draws on more than 2 years of Protection Approaches work in and with schools. Their national education programme works with schools around Britain to develop and run programmes that equip students and teachers with the strategies they need to reject prejudice and violence. The paper sets out how schools-based education can foster resilience to national as well as global crises, including democratic backsliding, conspiracy, and all forms of identity-based violence. In addition to conveying the evidence of best practices from around the world, the paper aspires to build a more coherent and joined-up approach in England to prioritising critical and compassionate competencies across the curricula and through whole school approaches as the most efficient and cost-effective means to build individual and social resilience to crises of all kinds. The publication begins with a strong argument. It says, in an area of increasingly complex and rising threats to the contemporary world, from online harms to rising polarisation to the long-term impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change, it's urgent to ensure next generations have the tools and strategies they need to understand, discuss, and tackle challenges of all kinds. Now, from both my time in the classroom as a teacher and now observing student and teacher behaviour as a journalist, this description of a polarised society sadly is highly recognisable. Previously, schools were able to operate mainly in the grey of a debate. There was room for opposing views. It feels as if in recent years we've made less room for this grey and a forced picking of sides has ensued. When I read about the place citizenship has in schools in this publication, it brought me right back to my days of standing in front of a whiteboard in Essex, trying to deliver lessons on democracy to Year 8 students. It says, in England, for example, citizenship education has long been seen as a secondary priority to core academic subjects in a system that rewards exam success over the resilience of the young people that take that exam. Citizenship has vanished or is vanishing from many of our schools. We lack teachers properly trained to deliver the lessons and who themselves have left an education system who did not equip them with the knowledge they need, continuing a cycle of poor teaching and poor knowledge. The publication calls for schools to co-create and sustain whole school approaches to strong and inclusive school communities and to build and sustain an inclusive school culture. It asks schools to create guidelines for teachers to embed critical and compassionate competencies across subjects. It also asks for schools to provide ongoing pre-service and CPD teacher training for teachers in order to deliver these things in their lessons. All of these things are completely within the power of schools to do, but are sadly impossible unless we also give schools 2 things they're in short supply of: funding and time. Today we'll be discussing the publication with Delia Zwart, the author of Protection Approaches paper and Protection Approaches first research fellow in the Futures of Education. Delia is an education expert with nearly 10 years of experience managing education programmes and researching how educational systems can create more inclusive, democratic and peaceful societies. She has worked as the Education and Outreach Manager of Protection Approaches, a role where she has engaged thousands of school children as well as hundreds of teachers and community builders in the strategies and tools they need to tackle prejudice and build stronger communities. In the summer of 2021, she was appointed as Protection Approach's first research fellow in the Futures of Education, where she will continue to advise the PA team and contribute to their education programme. But before she joined Protection Approaches, she worked on the Peace Programme at the Quaker Council for European Affairs, and she is the co-founder and chair of the board of directors of the UKMO Foundation, an organisation that works to empower young people as active members of their local and global communities through education. And then in this September, not too long now, she's going to begin a PhD in international education at New York University's School of Culture, Education and Human Development. She already holds a BA in social anthropology from Harvard University and an MA in international studies and diplomacy. Thank you for joining us today. We're also joined by Kavita Tanna, the founder of social enterprise Globally Reconnect. She is a coach and facilitator of mission-driven work with communities around the world. Kavita coaches educators to recognise the roles they play in shaping the identities, attitudes and behaviours of all learners. By co-designing learning experiences, she offers practical ideas for global and intercultural mindedness for all learners, including parents, educators and leaders. Through her work as a passionate advocate and mentor for social, emotional, ethical intelligence and well-being integration in the lives of all people, Kavita's vision is to create a harmonious world in which all living systems can flourish. We have apologies from John Murphy, who you may have been expecting to see today. He is unfortunately unwell, but he would have loved to have attended. Dia, I'll come to you first. Please could you start us off by explaining us the need for urgency and your findings of the paper?
Thank you, Grania, for this wonderful introduction on the paper and on both me and Kavita. So this paper has been published at a time where we're facing growing global challenges around the world. And we know that many people feel very anxious about the future, whether it's looking at democratic backsliding, climate change, disinformation, structural inequalities, and racism. It's really a time of challenges that have gathered momentum as well during this period of crisis of COVID-19. And what this paper sets out to do, it sets out to draw on all of the research that we've been doing at Protection Approaches over the last few years, as well as think about what schools can really be doing at this time to build resilience, both within young people themselves, as well as within the education system. So we have an education program at Protection Approaches where we work with young people to devise strategies and tools to reject all forms of prejudice. We work with teachers and school leaders to build more positive school cultures. And through this work, we've been talking to thousands of students and hundreds of teachers about the kinds of challenges that they're facing today, not just around identity-based violence, but about those different challenges I just mentioned a little bit earlier. And it's a time where many teachers and many young people are concerned about these challenges, but are also feeling the need and the desire to address these crises in the classroom and in school settings, whether it is by creating more space and more time within the classroom or in debate clubs to talk about difficult issues, to talk about current events in a nuanced way where there's space for reflection and consideration and thinking about what kind of actions can be taken to address these issues. Whether it's about creating better resources to help young people navigate the online world and identify disinformation and harmful information, whether it's creating more inclusive leadership bodies in schools where students feel that they really have a stake in how decisions that affect them are made at that school level. So through this work with schools, we've talked a lot with students and with teachers, but we also know that there's growing demand for more compassionate and stronger education systems really across the sector and across civil society. We know this through conversations that we've had through the UNESCO Futures of Education consultation, which Kavita was a part of, as well as other experts from the education sector and young people themselves. We spoke to teachers at the outbreak of COVID-19 last year about what kinds of tools they needed in that moment to navigate the crisis, as well as any oncoming crises that they might face. And we talk a lot to different civil society organizations and communities here in the UK. And we consistently hear from them that they believe and they know that education is the most powerful tool that we have to prepare young people for a changing world, to build their agency and their resilience to withstand crises of all kinds. And this is so important, like I've just said, not just for the civic and personal development of these young people, but really for our societies, for our futures, for all generations. And at Protection Approaches, this is something that we've known and we've cared about for a really long time, but we think today in this context we're in is more urgent than ever. And we think that it's really important to start thinking about the kinds of changes and implementing the changes that are needed to build more critical and compassionate schools and schooling systems. We know that COVID-19 has accelerated many different challenges, and we know that many schools and teachers are very concerned about how to address particular challenges that are coming up to them in the moment. So it's really about thinking about, what kind of tools do teachers need, whether they're a citizenship teacher or a math teacher or a science teacher, to respond to the different challenges that they're facing, whether it's their concerns that maybe parents' WhatsApp groups are sharing conspiracy content, young people wanting to talk about current events such as the recent upsurge of violence in Palestine, Israel, or the Black Lives Matter movement, how to talk about structural racism, how to develop young people's skills to build their own mental health and well-being. These are all conversations that we've had with teachers and with schools. We know there's a real desire and a real want to address these issues, but we also know that there's a lot of barriers to taking this work forward because unfortunately there's a real lack of funding to provide training and support for teachers to take these new and different approaches forward. We know that there's a lot of pressure to have really good exam results, and that kind of squeezes the space for these different kinds of critical and compassionate competencies, as we call them. So we know that a lot of schools and a lot of teachers are already taking on these practices and implementing them in their schools and their classrooms, but that there's so much more that needs to be done to make sure that there's the systems change and the space and the time and the resources in place for young people and teachers and everyone who works in schools to really feel that they're part of inclusive and empowering and inspiring spaces. So that's really what this paper sets out to do, a vision for a low cost but high impact vision for schools to implement what we call critical and compassionate schooling. And when I talk about critical and compassionate schooling, I'm talking on the one hand about the competencies that young people need in this changing world, such as media literacy and dialogue skills and civic responsibility. But it's also that systems change that I've been mentioning that will enable all young people and their teachers as well to have those competencies, as well as the agency and resilience to make a change in this world. So if you look at our paper, you'll see that there's lots of recommendations that set out how this can be achieved, either through the curriculum. So that's something really that the government can take forward in terms of really thinking about what our national curriculum entails and what might be missing from it in the modern world, how that could be thought through not only at the top level of government, but by students and teachers and civil society organization, people who are kind of experiencing these changes on the ground and what really needs to take place to help young people navigate this really complex world. And it's not just about changing the curriculum, it's about making sure that there's legislation and funding and support to take that forward and make sure that it's implemented in a good way. And then the other part of our recommendations speak to what we call whole school approaches. And this is what happens inside and outside the classroom. It's really about a way of thinking and doing within a school that centers these critical and compassionate ways of doing things. So it's about student leadership bodies and debate clubs and school policies on behavior and really the school culture at the very heart of it. And that's something that schools can really take a lead on with the support of civil society, support of government, but it's really about having meaningful conversations across the school community and thinking about how those conversations can lead to new actions, new practices. And we know from our work in schools that there are so many great practices already taking place and many civil society organizations that are doing that work. I've seen that through my work in London and around England, through my work at Protection Approaches. I've seen great practices as well through my work in the non-formal education sector in Bosnia. So I know that there is a lot of capacity and wisdom and expertise that already exists, but there is that systems change that's needed to kind of elevate all of that great work and make sure that it is part of the system itself. So it's not really a prescriptive one-size-fits-all vision. It's really about finding out what matters within different schools for different individuals and creating spaces for those meaningful conversations to happen. And it speaks to the strength of the English system as well as what is set out in Sustainable Development Goal 4.7. So there's also a global element to this where we're all working in a more interconnected world, addressing similar challenges at global scales and national scales. So it's also about strengthening our place in the world as well. So none of these changes are a pie in the sky. They're things that can be achieved. They're realistic. And I invite all of you who are participating today in this webinar to think about the kinds of recommendations set out in the paper, as well as some of the things that might come up in this conversation today about things that you might be able to take forward in your work or with those that you work with, so that we can have a more critical and compassionate schooling system. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Now, I think Kavita and I just spent our whole time then nodding really passionately as you were speaking. But Kavita, I'm going to pin you down. What specific things really resonated or inspired you when you were reading that paper, and from what Delia's also just said?
Thank you for asking, Grania. And I really want to begin with congratulating Delia on her paper. One of the things that I sort of said to her this morning before we began the webinar is how clear she has been in, really emphasizing the urgency of the recommendations that she's made, but also speaking very directly and not holding back to say, do you know what, the COVID-19 pandemic has raised so many things, it's made so many things visible to us that we really do need to be engaging in those meaningful conversations. And actually, that's one of the ways that Delia and I first connected, because at sort of in the next few months, I'll be launching my podcast, and it will be entitled Reconnecting Through Meaningful Conversations. And so I guess, in terms of what Delia just shared with us and what's in the paper, the things that resonated with me the most are the recommendations of, how we might engage all stakeholders in this conversation. So one of the things that came up for me, and there were three actually from what you had said, Grania, as well as what Delia had shared, that I wonder how it might feel if in education, in schooling, we were to reframe the obstacles or perceived obstacles of resources / training and time to making change, and reframe them as opportunities for authentic agency, not only for the young people, but also for the educators, meaning that we trust our young people and our educators enough to give them the agency to respond to what is emerging in classrooms, and to really be critical thinkers themselves of a curriculum that has been written many decades ago at this point. I believe it's over, a century ago now, with, not very regular reviews, and to really trust that, it might be possible to respond to the needs in the moment. The second thing that emerged for me as you were talking is we're inviting, meaningful conversations, but in that really meaningfully collaborating. And I came across a beautiful definition of collaboration, which was collaboration is not just the gluing together of existing egos, but the generation of ideas that were created after everyone entered the room. And so if we are really laying the standard of collaboration to hear all voices, then one of the things that I would suggest is that it needs to be meaningful, which in my mind means that we need to be really clear about defining the terms that we're using. And that was another part of the paper that really resonated with me, that Delia did really clearly detail what she meant by critical and compassionate schooling. And so, I really want to draw everyone's attention to those definitions and what they mean to you. And the third point that sort of emerged as I was listening to you both is with respect to this perceived, lack of time. And I wonder if we could reframe that in terms of connected prioritization. Because, oftentimes we complain that I don't have time to do this and I don't have time to do the other. My suggestion is that when something is important enough to us, we make the time and we find the time, other things become less of a priority and we make the time for whatever it is that we're looking to prioritize. And as a result of, feeling like we have authentic agency as young people or adults, feeling like, we're engaging in collaboration where we're clearly defining the terms, we're having the opportunity to say what we mean and mean what we say, then perhaps it is going to be possible to have this connected prioritization where we all agree that, for example, Delia's suggestions are going to be the top priority in our work. So perhaps we need to let go of some things that aren't sort of helping us to live more harmoniously in our present and in our future. Perhaps we do need to move on and be brave enough, trust our own intuitions enough, and really feel that we can find freedom in our relationships that allows us to learn in a way that is in integrity with what's actually happening in the world around us, and not treating school as a little box that we enter and it's in isolation to what's really happening in our own lives. And actually it becomes part of the fulfilling lives that we all wish to lead, where we can find our own purpose, we can really express our passions in our most creative ways, and also feel that we're making a positive contribution to the society that we live in, whether we see that as a local society or a global society.
Thank you. Now, Delia, I'm going to come to you. What is the support from civil society and government that schools need to successfully implement these critical and compassionate schooling suggestions that you're making?
So thank you for that question. And it ties actually quite nicely to what Kavita was just sharing as well about kind of reframing maybe how we think about some of the barriers. So in the report, you'll find some recommendations that are set out for schools, for civil society, for government, how this critical and compassionate schooling can be taken forward. And what we hear a lot when we work in schools is this pressure of time and space to take on a lot of these issues, because there is a lot of pressure from the education system itself on exams and attendance and all these kind of daily things that kind of squeeze that space for really prioritizing critical and compassionate schooling. So the recommendations try to address that kind of systems element of it from the education system itself and the kind of pressures it puts on schools, as well as it addresses a little bit what Kavita has just been addressing in terms of this individual agency and how we work with one another and think about prioritization. Because what these recommendations try to set out is how we can create that space and that time through incentivization and support, mutual support, and how we can work together in more genuine and collaborative ways. So like I've been saying a little bit earlier, we know that lots of teachers want to support their students to address a lot of these issues. And it's not a lack of wanting to why they're maybe not responding to some of these issues in the moment in the classroom. Sometimes it's a sense of nervousness, not really knowing how to have a dialogue about a really difficult and sticky issue, or not thinking that it's going to be important for the exam later on. There could be a host of different reasons, but at the end of the day, teachers join the profession because of this desire to help young people become critical and compassionate citizens. So what we're trying to think about with these recommendations is what kind of support could help schools and teachers bring forward some of these practices in their own space. So for example, we know in England, there's a lot of expertise both within schools, so amplifying those stories of how schools are working with their teachers and their students in really meaningful and inclusive and collaborative ways. That can be a helpful starting point for some schools. They might not want to do it in the exact same way, but they might think about some of those reference points. Working with civil society organizations, we know that there are a lot of fantastic organizations in England that do fantastic work. Some of them get a shout out in the paper, and certainly not all of them. But we know that there's really a lot of expertise on how to hold positive debate, how to think about restorative justice instead of punitive behavioral policies in schools. So being able to work with those civil society organizations can be also another starting point to think about what kind of practices could be adjusted in day-to-day life of the schools, and how to take those forward. Of course, all of those things sound great if there isn't the kind of funding and support, which is why we also have some recommendations for government to think about how teacher training, continuous teacher training, so both before teachers become teachers, when they're still student teachers, as well as while they're in the field, really making sure there's enough funding in place for teachers to have access to continuous professional development opportunities. So teachers might be able to pick up some of those skills along the way and think about some of those kind of sticky issues and how to address them in the classroom, as well as how to create co-creation practices to work with the whole student and school body about how to take some of these different areas forward. So in essence, the recommendations kind of set out how critical that role is of both civil society and government to work in partnership with schools. There shouldn't be pressure just on one part of the sector or another. What we're really envisioning with this report is a joined up approach where there is that mutual support kind of woven into how government and civil society interact with schools.
It's so important what you've hit upon there, the fact that if you are given the time and it's mandated, then teachers aren't pinching time. We ask people who work in education all the time to, give more of themselves, give more of their free time, because we know teachers go into the job that they do because they care about their children, they care about changing society. They do it for, much of the time from the teachers that I speak to and the research that we look at, we know that they do it for reasons to better society and to help their students. But when we pinch time, when we ask them to take time out from, we ask them to do something without removing anything from the curriculum, things are done poorly. And that's the worst thing that could happen. When we read all the recommendations that you've made and we look at the evidence that we have that change needs to happen, that we need to do things differently, society is changing, therefore the way we treat our children in society needs to also change too. If we don't properly plan these things, if we don't properly resource them, we run the risk of just doing it poorly and therefore create just more damage and not really truly address the issues. It's too important to shortchange teachers and students and educators on this. And I completely agree with the recommendations that you've made, that it needs to be something that's joined up thinking. We need to start sharing our best practice. We need to start looking outwards at what other schools are doing to see how we can also emulate that in our own settings, and that kind of clever time-saving ways of operating. It's out there, it's possible, but we need to make sure that we're not rushing straight into implementation and actually taking the time to really think about how we're going to do this. Now, Kavita, you have worked around the world on creating more empathetic and inspirational schooling, including for your newly established social enterprise, Globally Reconnect. What do you believe is the global best practices that you think could strengthen the British education system? Thinking about all the experience that you've had already, what would you do? I'm giving you a magic wand now, you can do what you like.
Thank you for that, Grania. And thank you, Delia, again for all of the things that you emphasised just then. I think one of the places that I would like to begin is with what I sort of mentioned earlier, and I emphasised it again in response to one of the questions that was shared in the Q&A. And that is, how are we defining the terms that we're talking about here? Because for example, one of the areas of sort of, a framework, if you like, that Delia has referred to are the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular number 4 for quality education, and then even further to 4.7. And one of the things that struck me in my first engagement with the Sustainable Development Goals is that although number 3 refers to good health and well-being, there was much more of a leaning towards physical good health, and one reference to mental health, but really it didn't really give us a holistic approach to well-being for us to work with. And so my current feeling about the work that I'm doing in, as you mentioned, different parts of the world, is that a lot of the educators that I've been working with have really appreciated having the opportunity to ground themselves, first of all, in their own sense of what it means to be well. And so one of the experiences that I guide the educators through is to really think more intentionally about what they need in order to be well, so that they might be open to learning new approaches, so that they might be open to having the headspace to do the reprioritization that I referred to earlier, and really sort of feeling that they are well cared for. And I really I really feel inspired to, to send out a rallying cry to school leaders, because more than in any other industry that I've worked in, because working formally in education is actually my third or fourth career now. But what I've really noticed is that leadership in schools hold an immense amount of power and influence over what teachers feel confident, empowered, even comfortable to do. And so, really sort of spending that time with your team to find out what it means to them to be well has been cited as the greatest investment by most of the school leaders that I've been working with. And so, it's been quite fascinating to work with school leaders in Europe, in Australia, in Africa. We're working in 3 different countries in Africa currently. And, just really sort of thinking about, okay, and when I've come to America, because I'm currently actually in the US, what it's meant to teachers, particularly high school teachers, that have never been asked that question. And so they actually really struggled with it, to define for themselves what it means to be well. And my feeling around all of this is that once we've found the language for ourselves, then we're better equipped to be able to support our students to find that language as well. And when we're all able to talk more openly about what we need in that moment, to feel grounded, to feel like, we can trust our own intuition, to feel that we have agency in our work, the possibilities expand exponentially. And so from that place, we're able to say, okay, well, now my needs are being looked after. Let me have a look at what else the people around me need. And to be able to look through different lenses at the community around them. So what is it that is working in our community? Do we have good communication skills? Do we have enough opportunities to gather together as a community and do meaningful work? Whether that's creating opportunities for fun, or whether it's actually thinking about, for example, I was in a small town in Montana for 2 weeks, and we had discovered that, it was really important to consider how we're living with other living systems in that community. So thinking about the fact that the community was originally built around a railroad, but is on the edge of Yellowstone Park. And so when we're thinking about, the fact that we've got grizzly bears that are being rescued, and then but they're listening to train noises. And so then they're not foraging naturally for their food. They're not, they use their different senses in order to find food. Like the depth that the 5 to 11-year-olds went to of understanding, what these beautiful creatures need, after we had spent some time helping them to identify what they needed, it was just profound. It was just amazing. And the community itself is a hunting community, but you've got these young people encouraging their parents that maybe we don't need to continue with these practices. Maybe there really are opportunities for us to find ways to live together on that grander scale. Now, in England, we don't have grizzly bears, but we can still be thinking about, whether we're in an urban community or a rural community, we can still be thinking about what's working around us and what isn't working around us. How many opportunities are there for social connection? How many opportunities are there for learning? I was away in China for 4.5 years, and I came back and all of my local libraries had been closed. And for me, that was quite shocking, because the library had been one of the opportunities that I'd had as a child, not only for learning, but also to be with friends learning together, also to be learning from elders and all of that kind of thing. And that was another thing that I wanted to highlight from Delia's paper, that she talked about the othering that can occur, when we think about identity-based issues. And one of the areas that I'd like to add to the list is age, and how in our culture, what is our perception of ourselves as elders, and what is our perception of the youth. And do we actually see the strengths and the assets that young people bring into the world? Or are we othering and forgetting that we were once children ourselves that had opinions, that had ideas, that had aspirations, ambitions, thoughts, you know, and we were desperate to share, and for some of us just shut down, you know. And, you know, can we create, you know, a culture in England, in around the world really, where all of our voices are seen, heard and felt and valued? That's really sort of what I'm wondering, if we can follow some of the examples that I've seen abroad to do that in England.
There's a lot to unpick there. I mean, I think I speak for everybody in England that we are very pleased there aren't any grizzly bears. But that I love that image of them with the bears and the railway and that sort of clashing of these two. Like that movement to be more aware of our surroundings and more connected. It's certainly true. And I think that I too was a fan of the library like you. We probably would have been similar teenagers hanging out in the library together, having a great time with the books. And, you know, when we remove these spaces from our young people, we don't leave them as many options of places to go that are safe, that are dry, that are free. You know, this is incredibly important, that we think more than just what's within the walls and the confines of the school, but how those schools exist in the communities and what the communities are offering them in conjunction with the school. And does the school need to fill a gap which has been removed by something in the community? And you know, finally, the other thing that struck me when you were speaking, Kavita, is about that sense of what being well means. And, you know, in TES we recently published a piece, well, in the last 12 months, I think I speak for everyone when I say the pandemic has become a bit of a blur, but about the crisis fatigue that teachers were expressing that they were feeling in the classroom. And this sort of worn out, and one of the signs that you might be experiencing crisis fatigue is an inability to be compassionate to those that are also experiencing trauma in front of you, or that are finding things difficult. Because when you're not well in yourself, it's so much more difficult to care for those who need extra support. And unless our educators are well and feel well and can articulate what well means, then they can't support the young people in their care. And that's, you know, that's a crucial part of being an educator in a school. Now, Delia, I'm going to come to you. Do you have any questions for Kavita?
Wow, so much just resonated from what both of you were just sharing. But I do have a question for you, Kavita, which actually links a little bit to one of the last things that you were talking about, which is how to create a school within a community where everyone feels that their voices matter and are valued, which is at the heart of this paper in many ways. And I remember when we were last speaking, you were telling me about working in a summer school where you're working with educators through co-creation practices and by creating space for meaningful conversations with them and then helping them embed those practices in their work. And I wondered if you wanted to share a little bit more about that, because that's something that is talked about in the paper as well. How can civil society and other organizations support educators create these practices, and what does it take to really embed them in everyday work? And I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about how that went for you and everything.
Thank you, Delia. So yes, I, much to the surprise of a lot of my friends and colleagues, I actually ran a 2-week professional learning program live with students. So whatever we were discussing in our adult connection from 8 till 9 a.m. or 8:30 to 9:15 a.m. as it became, was we had the children coming in right in front of us immediately thereafter to be able to apply some of the principles that I was sort of sharing with the educators. So it was a really hands-on opportunity. And what that meant was that absolutely all students had a voice in response to what was happening. And, you know, sort of really, yeah, it was a really hands-on learning experience for everyone involved. And, you know, in the Q&A, there's a question around teachers conspiring with young people to disrupt unjust education systems. And I guess, you know, my response to that is going to be a little bit sort of bouncing off of what Grania was just sharing about the libraries and how they provided a safe and free space to, you know, connect with others, but also, you know, to really have that opportunity to learn with others, and then, you know, hopefully go out in the world and take action by having conversations with others about what we're learning. And so both of the events, I think, you know, tie together in that way, that, you know, we're really creating those opportunities to be able to do that, to be able to, you know, have a safe space together. And I would suggest that rather than, you know, sort of feeling an urgency to conspire, or, you know, like to you know, take action outside of the system, how might we work together within the system so that there really is a safe space where people can be brave and can express their ideas and thoughts and opinions. And one of the ways that I would suggest that that was happening during these 2 weeks that Delia is giving me an opportunity to talk about is through really showing up in curiosity. And so what I mean by that is that, you know, if, for example, you know, some of the young people had spent the entire summer at camp and really hadn't had much sort of home time or, you know, opportunity to sort of be alone. So, you know, there really was an opportunity there to show up in curiosity and ask key questions like, tell me more about that, or, you know, how is that making you feel? Maybe I can help you to find the words to explain, you know, how you're feeling, because as I mentioned earlier, the children were quite young. What are the stories that, you know, you'd like to share with us so that we might be able to better support you and create the opportunities for you to have the kind of fun that you feel you're missing out on by not being at home and things like that. And so one of the things that I would also raise about that time is how much it revealed the importance of meaningful, authentic partnerships between home, you know, family as the first educator, school, and our wider community. And so, you know, in terms of making sure that everyone has a voice, I would suggest that there does, my sort of suggestion would be really thinking about the school as the hub of the community. So if we were to sort of take out a map and place the school in the center of that map, then who do we have around us that might be part of that support structure? Because inevitably, you know, where we live, we have a vested interest in what's being done in that area, and, you know, how are people living with us in that space? And so how might it be if all of us as adults, no matter what profession we're in, we all had a vested interest in, you know, what's happening in that learning environment. And we were all keen to support in any which way we can, whether that's through bringing our other experiences in the world to those young people as inspiration for what young people might be able to do, you know, in the wider world, whether that's on a voluntary basis while they're still at school, or soon after school, or even during summer, things like that. And then also thinking about, as I sort of alluded to earlier, what are adults unsatisfied with in their local community that they hope that the other, you know, the younger generations might be able to support their work in improving? You know, is there opportunities, are there opportunities for connections between the elderly and the young? Are there opportunities for connections between young parents and, you know, sort of older educators that are looking to support, you know, a different style of learning and things like that, or for the older educators to learn from the younger people, or, you know, so it's just really thinking about how might we really move away from a world where everything is disconnected and isolated and separated, and really bring communities together, holding more community events in the school building itself, things like that, you know, and just really trying to bring everyone together. Because again, that was one of the key elements of the school that I was working in Montana, because it was actually on the main street. So it really was a place where everyone could see the front of the school, and we were very intentional about what was displayed in the windows in order to attract the right kind of attention. And, you know, the intention is to be holding fortnightly or monthly community events at the school. in order to support the work there and to support the community development. So I hope that answers the question.
It isn't until you just spoke then that made me consider how a safe space is quite new to our vocabularies, isn't it? And it runs the risk of not really having any thought attached to it anymore. It's said almost in such a derogatory way, and many times like this is that people make jokes about a safe space and etc., etc. But unless you actually provide a meaningful, a real safe space, those conversations that we're calling upon educators to have with people in their community cannot take place. You know, we need to genuinely consider what a safe space consists of for different people too. And you know, your talk about where you spoke about intergenerational projects. It's something that, you know, TES we're really passionate about. We ran something last Christmas about calling for schools to write letters to people in care homes who are having particularly lonely Christmases due to the COVID restrictions, and seeing the reactions and the responses of the older generation reading these letters. We had a few that were recorded and shown to us. It was so moving, and so much wisdom being shared between older people and younger people to older people. It's, you know, these sort of relationships aren't beneficial only one way. It's something that is reciprocal, and it's so important to foster. And in a society where, because of work patterns, because of changes in the family dynamic and the family the way that we're made up, it means that we don't always have the same opportunities to have these things. They happened in the past because of the way that grandparents often took on a caring role or lived in the home still. That doesn't happen so much anymore. So we need to think about how we can facilitate that. And your point, Kavita, about a school being a hub, somewhere where people come together. You know, as a parent myself, I adore my children's school. I can see that I see myself as part of it because we're invited in. We're asked to do things. We see it as a part of our community, and using the space. How valuable is a school building that you can use all year round and use in the evenings? And when people feel part of something, when they feel like they belong, they'll give more of themselves to it. They'll be more supportive. They'll be more involved in their children's education. And that's how we can make a change, because we're breaking a cycle. We're breaking a cycle of years and years of disconnect with education and reconnecting people in different ways. So I hope, Delia, that answered your question. I felt like it answered the question. But now, Kavita, to only be fair, do you have any questions now for Delia?
Well, it's interesting to me, Grania, that you sort of actually referred to a key word that I wanted to sort of tie into Delia's question, and none of this was rehearsed, so it's fascinating to me that happened. But it was that sense of belonging that you mentioned, because one of the best definitions that I've come across of resilience, and resilience is a word that I felt was used quite frequently in the paper, referred to a sense of belonging in creating, you know, resilient people. And so I'm really curious to hear from Delia, what do you mean by the word resilience, and you know, sort of thinking about that in terms of what might, you know, the attendees of this webinar take away with them today as almost immediate actions, you know, that if we want to help our young people to be more resilient, if we want our elders to be more resilient, if we want our educators to be more resilient, what might we do? What do we mean by that word?
Yeah, thank you, Kavita, for picking up on that word. And I think to me and the work I do at Protection Approaches, resilience, it's a very multifaceted term. And I know it's used in different ways in education settings and other places, but when I talk about resilience in my work, it has an individual component to it and a societal component to it. So it's kind of connecting the two as well. I appreciate that this conversation, we've been talking a lot about interconnectedness, and I think that's a really important thread in that term. So it's about young people as individuals and the kind of resilience that they build for themselves, whether it's resilience in the sense of the word mental health and well-being, which we've been talking about at this event today. So really knowing and understanding what matters to them and how to take care of themselves. But then there's that social part of it as well. We can never be resilient if we're only looking out for ourselves. So thinking about that kind of sense of care for ourselves, for others, for the environment, for the world that we live in. And that word belonging that you mentioned as well is such a key part of that, because we feel resilient when we feel that we are included somewhere, that we feel that we belong somewhere, that we matter, that we are valued, that we have a stake in everything that's happening around us. And that's why you can't really separate the individual from the social. They need to be interconnected and they need to be woven together. Some of the competencies that we talk about in the paper are what we think underpins resilience in a schooling context. So that's not just feeling respect for yourself, it's feeling respect for others, and it's also about how we engage with one another in an inclusive way. So if we see our peers doing something that we don't agree with, or that is problematic behavior, thinking about the kinds of ways that we can call that out, or call it in, I should say, in a way that helps us bring attention to issues that we see around us. So there's an element of critical thinking to that as well, thinking about the world around us and being able to interpret in a way that brings us forward together and brings us closer to a more resilient society. So yeah, the word resilience to me has a lot of different components to it. And I think it's really important to bring that out, because I think sometimes we think of resilience just in the sense of grit, that young people need to build stamina. They need to be able to undergo a rigorous exam and rigorous qualifications, but that's not really what we mean when we talk about resilience. It's a much more multifaceted way of learning and a way of being in a school that is part of what we think of critical and compassionate schooling. And I think the building blocks of that are absolutely belonging, self-esteem, young people feeling, confident in themselves and proud of themselves and able to express themselves, feeling included, and also how the school facilitates all of those different feelings and emotions. Kavita, I really appreciate what you were saying about community, because to me, when I think about schools, I think about them as so much more than spaces of learning in terms of knowledge, in terms of information. They're really communities of themselves, as you were saying, Grania, as well, in terms of how you feel part of your school, your children's school. They are communities, they're social places. It's where young people develop themselves socially and have opportunities to develop themselves civically as well. And I think it's so important to frame schools as communities, to really think about them that way, because just that kind of way of thinking of a school can change the kinds of ways that we approach a school, the way that we approach the practices in a school, the way we approach young people in a school. If we think about schools as communities and a place where we can build young people's resilience, whether it's their well-being and their ability to navigate different crises and different challenges, be able to bounce back, but also to build back better. If we think about schools in that way, then I think we approach young people in those spaces in a different way, just like you were saying, Kavita, not in this way that we might approach them as being young and maybe not knowing as much of the world, but creating spaces of intergenerational learning, spaces where young people are able to take their learning forward in terms of the actions and the projects that they might want to implement. So that framing of resilience is really about thinking about those education spaces as communities, as spaces where we can build stronger communities, places where we can build that resilience in a really strong and interconnected way as a important part of the community itself, the school, but also as a way that young people can bring those tools forward beyond their time in school. And that's why we think at Protection Approaches that schooling is so important and so much at the heart of our societies, because everything that young people experience in that school is what they're going to take forward with them for the rest of their life. So if they're able to think about resilience and what it means to them and what it means to their peers and their school culture and the school climate, and what kind of communities they want to create after they leave the school, what kind of communities they want to be a part of and support and empower, then we set them up for a world in which those things can take root and can actually transpire, rather than just be abstractions that they think about in terms of the classroom. So that's really what I mean by resilience. Thanks.
As you were speaking then, Delia, I was thinking about what is the purpose of school? What do we want young people to have when they leave? And it doesn't matter how smart you are or what gifts you have or where your talents lie. Every single student could leave feeling more resilient, couldn't they? Like it's not something that's based on your intelligence. It's not something that relies upon, a particular personal attribute. We can all teach our children and encourage our children to develop resilience, and if they have that, then everything else will come that little bit more easily. Like, it prepares us in so many more ways. If schools were simply exam factories, if that's all we really did care about, we would do it much differently. That's clearly not the purpose of a school. And so if we can agree that that's not the main point of a school and developing resilience is a priority, then, you know, all these things would work together and every child could be successful at school. And wouldn't that be wonderful? So, you know, we've talked a lot about fairness and equality today, and in the bid for fairness and equality, I'm asking you who are watching now to ask questions that you would like to have put to Kavita and Delia. There's a chat function on the right hand side of your screen. If you go to, you might need to click the more button, there's a Q&A section and you can put your questions in there. So I have a little look what we've got now. So I'm going to start with Ellis Brooks. He says, I like the report's emphasis on ensuring all students have a voice. Would you agree that teachers need to be ready to conspire with young people to disrupt unjust education systems? So especially if school leadership and other power structures remain intransient. So who would like to take that? Delia, would you like to answer that? So he's asking that, he says that he likes the report's emphasis on ensuring all students have a voice. So in situations where that's not happening, would you agree that teachers need to be ready to conspire with young people to disrupt?
Thank you. That's a really good question. I think, Kavita, you already referenced an answer to that as well in your earlier response. And I think it poses a lot of interesting questions. I think if we think about schools as communities, then what role do teachers play when students disagree with or feel discriminated by the system itself? And I don't think there's one answer for it, to be honest. I think, Kavita, you made a really good reference to the fact that it's important to work within the system and to find ways within the system to navigate the challenges that we face. I know over the last year, there's been a lot of student protests, a lot of students calling for action by their schools. And this has resulted in some cases in meaningful dialogue with the senior leadership teams and students about the kinds of practices that are harming students, whether it's harming them because of race, because of ability, because of gender, and what kind of practices need to change so that students feel that sense of belonging and safety and inclusion within the school environment. But I also know that there are cases where those conversations haven't happened yet and they have been actively ignored. So I think it really depends on the ecosystem of the school, the situation of the school, where there is space for those voices and where that space can be created. So I think that teachers do have an important role to play, and why this paper also calls for this more critical and compassionate approach to schooling is that the hope would be that school leadership teams that have a lot of authority over the kind of vision of the school and the way that the school culture fits together take the time to really think about those practices and reflect on them, and find ways to really change those practices, because that's really important.
Okay, thank you. Now I have another question. It seems clear that creating a more critical and compassionate schooling system will mean persuading national policymakers to prioritise such a system. Is there work planned to use this report to persuade policymakers to make those changes?
Yeah, a great question. So protection approaches, our work is really centered on working with schools, working with young people, and working with policymakers, bringing evidence of best practice to policy. So through our work, we're thinking about ways in which to engage policymakers, thinking about the recommendations set out in the report. We're also part of a couple of different civil society networks that are also thinking about the policy change that's needed in England to set out what is set out in, achieve what's out in Sustainable Development Goal 4.7, such as the Our Shared World Network. So absolutely, there's a lot of thinking about the kinds of systemic changes that are needed at the policy level too.
Okay, this is a question that I think, Kavita, you might be well placed to answer. So Krista asks, well, she starts by saying something that's quite sad. She says in the US, she feels that schools are being pushed away from being safe spaces, with many states passing laws that put teachers even more under a microscope. And she is seeing teachers being more fearful that what they're teaching is going to be misinterpreted and used against them. She would love ideas of how to build up that safe space in these current times. Kavita, do you have any thoughts for her?
Thank you, Grania, and thank you for asking that important question, Krista, because I've actually been in the US for over 2 months now, and I'm very aware of some of the laws that have been passed in some of the states here. particularly around critical race theory. And it really does make things very stressful, uncomfortable, difficult for teachers, because it really has become a case of law. It really has become a situation where politics has come into school in a way of creating situations that it really sort of, it's not politics in the sense of a dialogue, as politics is supposed to be, an opportunity for people to come together and discuss how they want to live together. It's become more of a divisive tool. And so, in terms of building up that safe space in these current times, inevitably, I would never sort of sit here and advise teachers to put themselves in a position where they might become unsafe, either, economically or physically themselves, because, tensions are that high right now that unfortunately these considerations have to be mentioned. What I would like to invite educators to consider, however, is what I sort of alluded to earlier when I was thinking about defining well-being for ourselves as adults, so that we can better support our young people to define their own well-being, and to really allow yourself to have that time and space for yourself to work out where are your comfort zones, where are you willing to go, that will allow you to feel like you are giving your young people the opportunity to share their ideas. So does that mean that, where you might not feel comfortable having whole class discussions around particular issues, or creating opportunities for the whole class to engage in a debate around some of the things that are emerging through some of your teaching and learning? Is it possible for you to offer, small group opportunities? Is it possible for you to create time and space with your peers to be able to offer that time? What is your school leader thinking about all of these things? Would they be willing to take some time of a lunchtime once a week to create that safe space with you, in order to allow students' voices to be heard? Again, school leaders, you hold so much power and influence over the amount of safety, emotional, intellectual, physical, that is in your schools. And so I think that going to the school leaders would be the first thing that I would recommend, and having an open discussion with them about sort of what you feel could be helpful to create a safe space for young people to share their ideas. And I think, again, that goes back to what I was saying earlier about the school being the hub of the community, that at the moment, especially in COVID times, if schools are still operating, but everything else in the local community is shut down because of restrictions, then school is the one place where people are receiving and sending out messages about what they're thinking and feeling. And so it really has become more essential that we're creating a safe space to have these conversations, so that there can be a sense of understanding that there are potentially other ideas beyond what perhaps is being discussed in your own home, and being able to be open to different ideas and different perspectives, different ways of doing things, and just seeing how that influences the ideas and the actions of young people. But yes, it's a sensitive time right now. So thank you for asking that question.
Thank you, Kavita. And Krista, we wish you all the best with your attempts to try and create safe spaces in your school. We have a very interesting question here now. It's about prevent. So this person asks about the place that prevent has And did it come up in your research, Delia? Do you think Prevent is having, what impact do you believe that Prevent might be having on the critical and compassionate schooling? It's a really interesting question. So for those that might not know, Prevent is to do with the identification of terrorist organisations in school. As part of, all teachers have Prevent training and are trained to try and identify times when a child might be becoming radicalised by a terrorist organisation. So you're being asked, Delia, did you think about this when you were doing your paper?
Yeah, thank you. This is a really, really good question, and I have thought about it. It's not actually referenced directly in the paper, but it is an issue I've thought about in my work in a lot of different ways. I found it really interesting coming from the US and my own background. I think about what this duty, the safeguarding duty, means for schools here here in England that we work with. And there's a lot of research out there on Prevent about the impact on children's rights, the impact it has on children from different minority and different ethnic backgrounds. A lot of concern that it's kind of squeezed the space to talk about issues related to extremism and terrorism, as well as the effect on those young people and how they're treated in the school, how they are seen as perhaps being vulnerable or at a certain risk, elevated risk of concern. So I know there has been a lot of debate and a lot of concern about this that's written about elsewhere, not necessarily directly in this paper. I have read some interesting research as well that a lot of schools interpret the duty very differently, which is something quite interesting. So some schools do interpret it as an opportunity to talk more directly about difficult issues in society. So there are schools that treat it as a way to think about how to talk about extremism and terrorism and violence with young people in an age-appropriate way, but to bring those issues into the classroom rather than keeping them out of the classroom and simply treating it as a safeguarding, as a kind of top-down surveillance issue, which I know it's sometimes been seen as. So I definitely find it a very interesting element of schooling to think about and to be really mindful of, because I know that there's been a lot of concern also over the last year and about other different kinds of educational frameworks that are addressed in the paper, such as fundamental British values, that some of these agendas risk promoting a very reductive interpretation of citizenship, a very reductive idea of what it means to be British. I've been to some schools where fundamental British values are interpreted as having lots of flags and pictures of the Queen in the school, and I think this really misses the opportunity for thinking in a more complex and nuanced way about what it means to be a citizen of this country, of this world, to think about a more inclusive and a more meaningful way of engaging with citizenship. And I know that lots of organizations and schools are thinking about that, especially in the times we're living in today, in a world that's changing, in a world that's very diverse, in a world where we're talking about decolonizing the curriculum and diversifying the curriculum, how to make sure that schools are places where all young people are valued in that way, where their right to be heard is respected and upheld, and how different, how to make sure that these different agendas that might seem to be about critical compassionate citizenship actually can uphold those tenets that are set out in that paper, to make sure that our interpretations of citizenship and inclusion are really, really inclusive, and not in a passive way, but in an active way, that we're really making sure that different children from different backgrounds, from different parts of the world are able to feel that they can talk about themselves and express themselves and be a part of that school fabric, because at the end of the day, that's really what that word resilience, that word belonging means in that school context.
Thank you for that answer, Delia, and I hope that answered the question. So I'm afraid we've definitely run over the time. We haven't quite managed to hit the 5 o'clock deadline, but thank you so much for joining us and for the great questions that you've asked. I feel like the topics we've discussed today are ones that don't provide easy answers. This isn't a simple thing to think about. I've had to sit here and think really hard about the stuff that we've discussed, but I think it's hard thinking that has good rewards, and this is something that is worth our time, is worth our consideration, and I hope that everybody watching reads the paper, enjoys it, devours it, thinks about it, contemplates it. And before we all hit leave meeting today, please do take the time to consider an action or recommendation from the paper or from what we've discussed that you can take forward after the webinar. Maybe share this thought with one of your colleagues, tweet it out, start an action plan. We need to move these ideas from thoughts to realities. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. And thank you again to Kavita and Delia. You've been wonderful, and it's been brilliant to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Grania.